God's permissive will means that God allows bad things to happen so greater good may come of it. And in the early 1800s, something pretty gruesome and fundamentally anti-Catholic solved one of the papacy's biggest problems that had been plaguing it for centuries. You see, since the 1500s, the Pope had tolerated increasing government influence on his bishops, especially in France and Germany. The bishops of these countries invoked conciliarism, the idea that the power of a council of bishops outweighs that of a pope. While conciliarism was initially in reference to ecumenical councils, meaning the councils of all bishops, the local bishops eventually believed that national councils should be able to disobey a pope. This quest for independence was not a pure one, since rich and powerful elites funneled money into the pockets of bishops to control them. Welcome to part 7 of our series on papal authority, largely based on Klaus Schatz's The Papal Primacy. The European Enlightenment, which took off during the 1600s, focused on individual expression and freedom. This led to the rise of secular governments, and this trend deprived the Church of its cultural and political influence. The remaining Catholic nations, especially France and Germany, sought to preserve their faith, but only if it was according to their terms. As early as 1641, French theologians claimed that church communities were better represented by state leaders than by the Pope. Furthermore, when the Pope's representatives came to collect donations, local bishops didn't abide. This movement of rejecting papal authority in favor of state allegiance was called Gallicanism, and it can be characterized by a series of documents published under the King of France, King Louis XIV, in 1682. These articles are conveniently called the Four Gallican Articles. I will paraphrase them. Number 1. Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and my kingdom is not of this world." So the bishops should obey their king, and if the papacy is so concerned with money, it can just go fund itself. Number 2. The church has already defined that a council is above a pope, so the pope should respect the decisions of councils, even on the local level. Number 3. Contrary to the claims of medieval popes, the pope is not above church law, but is subject to not only the laws of ecumenical councils, but also of local customs of bishops. So if the French bishops decide they don't owe money, then they don't owe money. Number 4. Papal teachings are only valid if they are accepted by the whole church. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that this was not some fringe group that drew up these articles. You could not teach theology in France unless you swore an oath to uphold these. And here's the thing, to avoid a schism, Rome didn't condemn them for 8 years. By then, the damage had been done. In Germany, bishops were so dependent on princes and nobles for income, and Rome was so desperate to avoid a schism, that Rome granted dispensations left and right to German princes from obeying church laws. Another factor that contributed to these blows against the papacy was history. As ancient church documents were rediscovered, translated, and analyzed, independent scholars found out that the papacy's grand authority was, in fact, non-existent in the early church. Then the forgeries came to light. Yeah, a few episodes back we covered the false decretals, a series of forged documents that were used during the Middle Ages as evidence that the Pope had always had sweeping authority over bishops. Now, these documents were not the sole basis on which papal authority was established. They were merely one in the collection of many documents that supported the idea. Nevertheless, once it was found out that these decretals were actually written in the 800s versus the 200s or 300s, it caused quite the scandal. In fact, the year 840 was a cutoff year, as in any document written afterwards justifying papal authority was considered invalid by the Gallicans. By the end of the 18th century, things looked pretty dire for the papacy. But soon, France, the heart of the Gallican movement, was subject to an event that would both traumatize the local church, but end up unifying the universal church in the long run. 1789 marked the beginning of the French Revolution. The bloody, bloody French Revolution. Dozens and dozens of French clergy and their patrons were executed. Since the powerful families who controlled the bishops were killed, the French Revolution, horrific as it was for local Catholics, marked the beginning of the end of Gallicanism in France. In 1800, Pope Pius VI died a prisoner of Napoleon Bonaparte. And in 1801, the short French leader forced his successor, Pope Pius VII, to sign an agreement that dismantled and reorganized the German dioceses. This effectively dismantled Gallicanism in Germany. By the time Napoleon had taken over France, the French church was divided, and Napoleon didn't like that. So he had Pius VII depose all the French bishops and reorganize the church there as well. All bishops who refused were executed. In a couple of fell swoops, the secularist French government destroyed the only obstacles left to papal supremacy over all the bishops. And that's how the French Revolution saved the papacy. The Enlightenment and French Revolution exposed just how vulnerable the papacy was when it depended on secular authorities. And with the rise of the anti-religious secular state, the bishops begged for a papacy that could reign independent from the messy, destructive politics of rival governments. And this desire would culminate in the First Vatican Council, which we will discuss next episode. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.